Death is the event horizon of reason, on the end of argument and rationality, by O.G. Rose, as featured in The Map is Indestructible. The rational and logical end where death and apocalypse begin. There, the border of thinking is reached. If every man, woman, and child will die if I don't murder someone, is it still wrong to murder? In this situation, what is a clear immoral act is suddenly not so clearly immoral. It's as if the rules have changed, per se. If murdering a child will save the lives of 100 children, is it wrong? Outside such a situation, it is easy to say that it's always wrong to murder. But within such a situation, though it is perhaps still wrong, what is wrong is perhaps also the right thing to do. Whether or not it actually is entails diving into ethics, as discussed in Immorality by O.G. Rose, but the point stands that when death and apocalypse are involved, the rules of reasoning, logic, and morality can shift. If the world will end if X isn't done, then not doing X becomes hard to defend. How the rules shift depends on the situation. The only point I'm making here is that they shift at all. It is wrong to insult your wife. This is a rule that goes without say. But what if insulting your wife will somehow save her life? Wouldn't it be immoral not to insult her? If calling her fat will motivate her to exercise, adding another 10 years to her life, wouldn't it be wrong not to call her fat? See the problem. Once death is introduced to a discussion, an otherwise normal and undeniable rule suddenly becomes less objective, or does it? And this sort of apocalyptic and deadly thinking is a root cause of much marital trouble, I believe. Out of a mixed sense of love and urgent necessity, the husband and or wife says or does something that hurts the other, and a gradual and ever-widening gap can start to develop. Similar points can be made about the ever-widening gap between political parties, worldviews, and so on. Talking according to different rules, a person who believes we must raise the minimum wage or the country will collapse will reason and talk past someone who thinks keeping minimum wage low will not cause such dire consequences. And in fact, the person may believe lowering minimum wage could benefit the country. The one who argues that murder is always wrong will likely talk past the person in the situation where murdering someone will save millions. Between such individuals, misunderstanding seems inevitable, common ground unlikely. Considering this, an age of apocalyptic argumentation will likely be an age of incredible partisanship. We must be extremely careful before introducing apocalyptic or deadly scenarios into our discussions and arguments. Perhaps there are times when they are appropriate, but more often than not, they seem inappropriate and unproductive. It being such a powerful trump card, it seems we are tempted to overuse apocalyptic thinking in order to win debates. But this temptation must be resisted as much as possible, which the very fear of the apocalypse will make hard to do. Once we bring death and apocalypse into a discussion, the rules change, and what is usually unacceptable suddenly ceases to be so unacceptable. Perhaps this is called for, but we must reach this conclusion not through apocalyptic thinking, as we'll call it, but through incredibly self-critical reasoning. In other words, we must approach and even cross the border where reasoning as we know it ends by reasoning, not by apocalyptic thinking, for the latter is prone to see borders where they are not present. Section 1. Apocalyptic thinking and argumentation feel real and justified, no matter how hurtful, cruel, or so on. They also have an appearance of logic, for they appeal to causality. If you don't do X, Y will happen, and can be appealed to when an individual believes others are unreasonable. When others can't be reasoned with, the individual is likely to resort and appeal to fatal or severe consequences to generate what he or she believes is necessary, action. Apocalyptic arguments also have an appearance of finality that create urgency and emotion, perhaps influenced by television and how televised discussions and debates are formatted and conducted. This urgency can help legitimate apocalyptic thinking, for it inherently suggests that not accepting it will cause imminent and or irrevocable consequences. This is why being on one's guard against it and refraining from accepting it without irrefutable evidence is so difficult to do. Apocalyptic thinking and argumentation appear and present themselves as irrational to ignore. This is perhaps also why it is so tempting during debates or disagreements to use such thinking and argumentation, and why even the act of pointing apocalyptic thinking out can seem absurd and irrational. After all, the world is on the line. How can you risk the world? Apocalyptic arguments tend to be a kind of Pascal's wager, where following them is rational even if it turns out the proposed end is false. for better safe than sorry, right? See Concerning Epistemology by O.G. Rose. Really, such arguments should be avoided unless backed by irrefutable evidence and tend to fit the following rubric. If Y doesn't happen, X will cease to be. Therefore, X mustn't let Y happen. So you could say if Y, and then the other form of that would be if Y happens, X will cease to be X. Therefore, X mustn't let Y happen. If the economy will collapse if Y isn't done, then Y must be done. All discussion is finished. Likewise, if the world will end if Y isn't done, then Y must be done, regardless of the cost, suffering, and so on. For once the world is lost, the very ground is lost that makes decisions and consciousness possible. Yet, yes, perhaps one could argue that if a decision to save the world results in a loss of what makes the world worth saving, then perhaps the decision isn't so clear-cut. But this is an argument that must be addressed relative to the particulars of a given situation. What is clear, though, is that someone who believes if Y isn't done, the world will end, cannot talk to the person who doesn't hold the same premise, at least not easily. They will speak different languages, holding different axioms, and all reasoning will fly past one another. If the economy will not collapse if Y isn't done, then there is room for discussion about rather Y should be done. But once the apocalypse is introduced into the discussion practically ends. In fact, to use apocalyptic language in debate is somewhat contradictory, for it implies that the very occurring of debate or discussion is irrational. To even question, rather, what will save the world should be done is fundamentally absurd. There should be no discussion. What must be done, and this suggests why we must hesitate to introduce such premises into debates, especially without irrefutable evidence, but unfortunately apocalyptic thinkers will likely see all apocalyptic evidence as irrefutable. Section 2. Now, to say we must hesitate to introduce apocalyptic arguments into a discussion doesn't mean it is never appropriate, only that we mustn't be quick to do so or slip into apocalyptic thinking. Regarding the current conversation about global warming, it is very possible that a failure to lower greenhouse gases will destroy the world. However, appealing to the apocalypse to change behavior still might not be the most effective route. It might alienate people and make them feel as if they are being forced into a new kind of behavior and lifestyle without adequate explanation. Furthermore, even if it is true that the world will end if we don't lower greenhouse emissions, there is still the question of how Y is to be done. The debate is still open on those grounds. But it often seems that use of apocalyptic arguments skip over the how question without it being noticed. It is assumed that the how of the one making the apocalyptic argument is the correct and best how, when this isn't necessarily the case. Even if a person is right in making an apocalyptic argument, how we avoid the apocalypse is still a ground for discussion. But what if it is the case that if we don't do Y by Y method, the world will end? What if there is a particular how that must be followed or everything will be lost? If this is the case, all discussion will likely close down. If a certain how for a certain end is necessary for avoiding the apocalypse, that how and that end must be followed through, regardless of the absurdity, cost, sacrifice, and so on. And so apocalyptic hows are just as destructive to discussions as are apocalyptic claims. They are the end of reasoning, and so must not be asserted unless the asserter is absolutely sure and is backed by incredible evidence. For once someone argues that a certain how is necessary for a certain end by which to avoid the apocalypse, that person wins the debate and or discussion by default. The arguer has made an invincible claim. This isn't to say the person is necessarily wrong for doing so, only that the arguer has created an event horizon of reason. But can a person's apocalyptic claim be proven wrong? Perhaps, as it can be proven right. The point is that the use of such claims makes determining right from wrong difficult, for it brings into the discussion new rules without it being clear yet if those rules should be accepted over the current ones, assuming it isn't clear yet if the apocalyptic claim is true or false. This confusion is likely to make reasoning and argumentation more difficult, hence making it all the more difficult to determine which rules are the right ones to use, ever deepening the confusion. Section 3. If I argue that we must do Y to prevent a financial crisis, I am suggesting that to disagree with me is to usher in disaster. If I argue that if you don't do Y for your wife, you'll get a divorce, I am suggesting that if you don't do what I tell you, you don't love your wife. If I say that global warming will be the end of the human race, I am saying that we must stop it, no matter the cost, no matter if it causes suffering, no matter if it costs billions of dollars, no matter if it causes the human race to suffer for 1,000 years. I am also suggesting that if you do nothing about it, you don't want to save the world. Considering all this, ultimatums should be left out of a discussion unless supported by incredible evidence. For ultimatums collapse discussion and reasoning. This isn't to say there is no such thing as global warming or that economic measures should never be considered in light of a possible financial crisis, but that bringing these points to a discussion changes the rules per se. Rather than be stated directly, ultimatums should be pointed to by rationality. There are other forms of argumentation that are similar to apocalyptic argumentation insomuch as they shut down rationality. If I say God told me to, then I am suggesting that to disagree with me is to disagree with God. Perhaps God did tell us to do Y or Z, but to tell others that God said so may impede conversation. If I say X is good for the economy or in our national interest, I am saying that if you disagree with me, you're against the nation and the economy. Perhaps what I am arguing is indeed good for the economy and nation, but saying so directly versus through rationality can accomplish little more than suggest those who disagree with me possess bad motives. Likewise, a person who speaks in terms of justice and freedom speaks similarly to someone who speaks in terms of apocalypse. The person, for example, who argues we must provide some service to children, otherwise we violate family rights, appeals to a premise that has an authority similar to an apocalyptic premise. It changes the rules of the discussion, per se. And so these types of appeals should normally be avoided. This isn't because children don't have rights or that a certain service shouldn't be offered to them, but because such premises should be achieved by rationality and argumentation, not appeals to apocalyptic or semi-apocalyptic thinking, which collapses argumentation. Section 4. Imagine that we have the choice to murder 1 million people and, in so doing, save the world from blowing up. Note that the moral standards by which we would judge whether or not we should kill 1 million people may still apply here, but also note that the situation is not so simple. The choice between killing millions and keeping the human race alive is not the same as the choice of killing 1 million for no reason. With the second situation, it is obvious that murdering 1 million people would be wrong. In the first situation, it is not so clear, though that doesn't mean the answer isn't still the same. In this apocalyptic situation, the rules are different. How and in what ways they are different is complex in particular. And so when it comes to a civil debate, seeing a topic in light of the apocalypse will likewise change the rules. This isn't to say apocalyptic situations are impossible, only that apocalyptic thinking isn't the best way by which to identify and address them. For if a situation really is apocalyptic, reasoning and argumentation will unveil such to be the case without apocalyptic reasoning. Even if a situation is apocalyptic, using apocalyptic thinking at the expense of reasoning isn't advisable, for reasoning may lead you to the same conclusions as apocalyptic thinking without using it, while simultaneously checking, balancing fear, bias, and so on. Whereas yet apocalyptic thinking may worsen the situation and make the apocalypse more likely. Let us return to the question of murdering 1 million people versus ending the world. How would we make this decision? Well, obviously 1 million people in comparison with the trillions of people who could be born is less consequential, so to kill the 1 million would be rational. But wouldn't killing 1 million to save humanity violate human dignity? Wouldn't it color the human race in a barbaricism when that would take away the whole reason why human life was worth preserving? But if there is no humanity, there would be no dignity. Human life is the prerequisite for human dignity. But where there is life but no dignity, life isn't worth living. It lacks value. To sacrifice one for the other is to sacrifice both. But what if we must sacrifice one? Well, which is better? Neither. But we must pick. And so the debate rages. Ultimately, whether a person values human dignity over human life or vice versa is axiomatic, and arguably which of these axiomatic premises a person holds will determine how a person answers all moral questions throughout all the games of that person's life, to allude to Immorality by O.G. Rose, though this isn't to imply people can't switch axioms. It seems to be the final and ultimate question: is human life or human dignity more important? Often the values will cross, but sometimes they will split, like two streams intercepting one another and merging before heading their own ways again. When they split, everyone must make a decision for themselves, and when the streams split, when the streams split, tends to be in apocalyptic and or deadly situations. Hence, when a person appeals to apocalyptic thinking or reasoning, the person presents a situation as if it is one where human life and human dignity must be chosen between. To say we must stop global warming or the world will end is to say we must save the world even if we must do so at the expense of human dignity. To say we shouldn't torture or the terrorists will win is to say that even if it results in a nuke going off, we shouldn't violate human dignity, and so on. On the other hand, perhaps we say we must stop global warming or the world will end is to say we must save the world or changes in the environment will reduce us to monsters. Perhaps to say we shouldn't torture, the terrorists will win, is to say that a terrorist attack isn't as morally reprehensible as the possible reduction of torturers to beasts, and so on. Whichever way one means it, to use apocalyptic arguments is to appeal to an ultimate axiom upon which all other moral questions rest. When this appeal isn't appropriate, it greatly hinders and slows down rationality and argumentation. Section 5. Apocalyptic thinking points to what is ultimately an axiomatic debate between life and dignity, while simultaneously distracting arguments from the fact, through urgency, emotions, and so on, that their differences are ultimately axiomatic, and can make that difficult, if not impossible, to realize through rationality, since rationality is hindered by the very use of apocalyptic thinking. When two people disagree axiomatically, the two people will likely talk past one another. But if this talking past one another is reached through reasoning and argumentation versus direct appeals to apocalyptic thinking, at least there will be the possibility of the realization that the difference is axiomatic versus intellectual, as in related to one's reasoning. Hence, there is the possibility of the recognition that the other is capable of reasoning and worthy of respect. Realizing all this, perhaps the two parties will be capable of reaching an agreement and mutually beneficial compromise, rather than just blowing off the other as not caring about what really matters, according to the individual's apocalyptic thinking. We should never appeal to apocalyptic thinking unless earned by rationality and argumentation, which is probably rarely, and we should only make an appeal to the apocalypse directly when backed by incredible evidence and truth, if even then. If the world really is in an apocalyptic situation, such will likely be unveiled by rationality. The ends of apocalyptic thinking will be achieved without appealing to it, increasing the likelihood that an actual solution is found. Apocalyptic thinking is rarely, if ever, beneficial or justified, for it can only impede discussion, skew discernment by causing panic, the misreading of evidence, and so on, and realizes an end which reasoning could have achieved without it. Critical thinking, as explored in Uncritical Thinking by O.G. Rose, and reasoning are what we need to realize if an apocalypse is really happening, not apocalyptic thinking. Apocalyptic thinking cannot add any more value than what reasoning could add, and ironically may result in us not discerning the apocalypse accurately, perhaps even accelerating it while simultaneously robbing us of the capacity to recognize its approach. Additionally, apocalyptic thinking may make us apathetic, and then when and if the apocalypse really is a threat, we won't notice or care. Similar to the situation of the boy who cried wolf. Ironically, apocalyptic thinking can result in what we fear coming unto us. If the world will end if we do not do X, there is no debate. We must do X. In this way, apocalyptic thinking absolves me the responsibility to debate, to think through my ideas, and to learn civility. And this suggests why apocalyptic thinking is so tempting. Instantly, I don't need to think critically anymore, learn to suffer the existential anxiety of facing people who disagree with me, temper my self-righteousness, learn to live with mental uncertainty. There are countless comforting advantages to apocalyptic thinking. Additionally, it seems easier to form a tribe with emotional and apocalyptic arguments, the moral conviction to join me, and worry I can create in people who ignore me is incredibly powerful. Problematically, basic incentives favor apocalyptic thinking, and yet we must learn to resist this temptation, as we must resist using conflicts of mind or Ludwig to our advantage, per se. But what if others don't avoid apocalyptic thinking? Won't they thrive while we fail? With this, we hint at game theory and return to the ancient dilemma found in Plato's Gorgias, though the stakes might be rising. With nukes, interconnectivity, growing centralized power, little has changed. One of the great challenges of pluralism is that civilizations come to be composed of people who all have different views of what will destroy civilization and end the world, and hence what issues are those relative to which the rules of rationality are changed and or suspended. This leads to people talking past one another, breakdowns of democracies, populist uprising, limitations of free speech, and worse. To avoid these horrible situations, we must all be incredibly skeptical of apocalyptic thinking and develop a default against it. If it is legitimate in certain circumstances, it will survive our skepticism. If not, it won't. Ironically, when we apocalyptically think about what we apocalyptically think about is precisely that relative to which we will be tempted to lower our skeptical standards in order to save the world. And yet, for pluralism's sake, it is these circumstances in which skepticism is most important. In closing, where death and the apocalypse begin, rationality and logic end. And if we actually are in such a situation, the rules we so often use will no longer apply. And it would be wrong, confusing, and apocalyptic in a sense to change the rules when they don't need to be changed. In a truly apocalyptic situation, we'll have to think more critically than ever before. And apocalyptic thinking will only make that difficult task all the more difficult. In the end, it may turn out that we have to abandon what we know as reasoning altogether and make what Kierkegaard would call a leap of faith. But if we are reading this, that day has not yet come, and we should not assume it will. And if it ever does come, ironically, apocalyptic thinking will only darken our capacity to recognize it. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, Twitter, and so forth. And thank you so much for your time.